Hans Ulrich Obrist likes to use this example of the Vietnamese general Giap, who said that an increase or a gain in territory is a loss in concentration. I think this says a lot about what Nietzsche is dealing with in this situation of our um, the hypertrophy of consciousness, and the ability of all these different forms dancing before our eyes, and are losing ourselves in the variety, unable to gather the intensity of concentration. This problem, which is historical, and which one can see, for example, in the Nibelungenlied, for instance, the great intensity of such an epic, which, say in retrospect, we can say this is a monocultural epic. It's not. It has no consciousness of the multiculture of the that there's all different kinds of people all over the place. It's like the Japan that Mishima still speaks of when he says that the Americans forced the Japanese twice, once in the days of Admiral Perry, the opening of trade, but then again in World War II, to look at themselves in an American mirror, in a Western mirror, and therefore, and you can even see in Japanese sources that they say Japan simply had no awareness of the other cultures. It reminds, of course, of the what's always said about the Greeks, that they regarded everyone else as barbarians, right? So in Japan, we have this to a very late date, to World War II, and you can see when the concept of culture comes directly from the Americans, from people from the book, for instance, the book The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. It comes directly from the Americans into the Japanese consciousness. This is a fundamental loss, let's say a fundamental loss of concentration, right? It's a gain which may be a pseudo gain in territory. Now we know about all the other cultures, and in retrospect we can speak of before we were a monoculture. On the other hand, you could say before they were a world, now they are just a culture alongside the other cultures. That as it may be, this means that the Weltanschauung has to take awareness of this situation. But how so far does it take awareness of it? How so far does it just live in it as a Geschichte, as what it's in the midst of? And how so far does it come, like Nietzsche, to bring the highest piercing power of reflection to the difficulty, and then to raise it up to this, the whole philosophy of Nietzsche, which is a kind of Weltanschauung. It's actually a kind of worldview. And Heidegger says that this, and somehow Nietzsche is unable to make the separation, to really see this, to bring out the difference between Historia, understood as the human being, understood as the philosophy of Nietzsche, understood as the life-giving lie, understood as the attempt to bring about the eternal recurrence of the like or the same, with many complications, because Nietzsche also speaks, aside from the Übermensch, of the philosopher of the future. This is also a strange thing, and also he seems to suggest that there's some space between the philosophers of the future and the past of the tradition, where something's breaking open. There's all kinds of complications. But seen from Heidegger's point of view, there's this lack of, Heidegger makes this comment about how the Weltanschauung, or the comprehensive worldview, is a genuine event within the Geschichte. I think here the simple example of this is just the idea that that I believe I mentioned before is something along the lines of, for instance, people have language for a long time, they're writing for a long time, they have the art of writing, um, but then someone starts to either descriptively identify grammatical forms within the language, or prescriptively starts to invent them, as did the happened in the medieval universities. And then all kinds of rules crop up, and as Noam Chomsky points out, anybody who has within their native language effortless command of that language will then they don't need the grammatical rules. This is something added on, which is why uh, one makes so many grammatical mistakes. Um, so there's something already there, the Geschichte, and then it rises up. But this is just one example. Remembering the example of grammar is just one example. It might be a particularly essential example, but it's just one example that happens in all kinds of other ways. We can rise to a higher consciousness of anything we're already in the midst of. And then this rising to consciousness, in a way, it describes the attempt to think Dasein. So this rising to consciousness, nonetheless, is something. I don't know if we should call it an event, but let's say an event within the Geschichte, or in any case, it's part of the Geschichte in a way, but we can identify it because it's this remembering that the Historia, or this rising of the Weltanschauung, is being understood as the human being itself, and according to Heidegger and this Nietzsche's second essay in The Thoughts Out of Season. So there's a movement whereby we can't maintain a strict separation anymore here. It's all flowing. In this sense, one can see that the will can't have a single source where you can then say Nietzsche is willing this internal recurrence of the same in his Weltanschauung, in his superconscious view, which is trying to identify and tackle this problem of the overconsciousness of the infinite territory, which is, this is the problem that Spengler refers to as the Faustianism, and also Goethe goes into this quite a bit. There's a great book about Goethe in economics, written by a German professor, where he goes into this sense where the Faustian spirit is this spirit of the infinite, and which one can see very well in the development of economics, and we no longer properly admit the idea of that the desire to accumulate infinite sums is the characteristic of the miser, of Scrooge, of whoever you like, and that is a pathological characteristic. We've totally thrown aside the, let's say not absolutely, because we're still conscious enough of it that we can notice it, but for all practical reasons, we've thrown aside the normative psychology, which still attended to the thinking of the Adam Smith to Marx and so on. We've come into descriptive psychology, where we can no longer admit something like even the simple notion of the the functional utility of that a dollar is worth less to the billionaire. $1 more is worth less to the billionaire than it is to somebody with nothing. We can't really even admit that, because in the extremes, empirically, you will see that there can be a billionaire who will care more about the next dollar than will the person with no money. So you can't prescribe anything if you're only going by what actually happens. You can't say this person is pathological for doing that. This thinking of all of how we're capturing the whole view has to be part of the Geschichte, which is part of what used to be nature in a way. So you can't separate the will in any neat way anymore, and therefore, in this sense, we have to go over to the glass a night in some sense.